So thank you for inviting us. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the director of Popular Conservatism, a group that I set up with a deliberately ironic title, Popular and Conservative, in it. But I'm just going to start with three very short apologies before I get into things. Firstly, sorry we were a few minutes late. Had our train been on time, I think we would have been, but there was a slight delay at Gloucester, which I'm told by the locals you should always factor in on any train journey from London. So that's my first apology. My second apology is that PopCon has been so successful that we have achieved an almost unheard of achievement in modern politics. We have run out of leaflets. I've never known an organisation to have run out of leaflets. But if you would like to find out more about us, please just go to popularconservatism.com or find me afterwards, where I have brought dozens of business cards. Because if you've not signed up for our events, we run an online event about once every 10 days with great speakers. David's done a couple for us. Upcoming, we've got Andrew Rossendale, a new recruit to the Reform parliamentary benches. And shortly after that, Douglas Carswell. And it's completely free to join. You just join us on Zoom. You can put your questions to these speakers. And in addition to that, we do these sort of events across the country at the rate of about 2 or 3 per week. And we have a weekly newsletter completely free. So if you're not getting any of that and you'd like to, find me at the end. So that's my second apology, the absence of leaflets. And my third apology was when I gratefully accepted this appointment to come down and speak to you guys with David. Little did I know that it would clash with the rearranged football match between Leicester City and Southampton. So I want to apologise in advance that if I suddenly put my head in my hands or punch the air, it's more likely to do with a goal alert going off on my phone than it is with any pearls of wisdom that are past David's lips. So those are my 3 apologies. And then you've already been told the rough format of it. I'm going to engage in conversation with David for about 40 minutes or so, cover some of the main themes that we have been evangelising up and down the land, and then it's over to you guys to ask David or myself anything you want. And then I guess we'll wrap up at about 8:45, and we can stay around for a while to continue the informal discussion afterwards. So, David, I'm wanting us to get into the grand sweep of what's called the Starkey thesis over the course of this conversation. But I think it would be remiss not to begin with the pretty extraordinary events of the past few days. Peter Mandelson's, the exposure of Peter Mandelson's close links with Epstein, the whole furore about the Prime Minister appointing him. The PM has lost his Chief of Staff, lost his Head of Comms, apparently, and to my utter bewilderment, retains the support of his cabinet. So he limps on. But as I've put it on the radio yesterday, it seems to me that the death sentence has been passed. It's just we're not quite sure when the execution will be carried out. But what's your take on what's occurred here? Is this just another sleazy Westminster scandal of which we have become we've become all too familiar with, or is there something bigger and more significant going on here?
I think it's bigger and much more significant. I also think we should stop using the word sleaze for something like this. Sleaze is what happened under John Major. It's dirty £50 notes shoved in little brown bags. That is what I call minor retail corruption. This is something on a completely different scale. This is government by corruption. It's systemic and it's fundamental. And indeed, when our chairman kindly mentioned Starkey and Mogg, when Jacob and I discussed this, he, of course, at the end of it said, can you take us back to a point at which real corruption, entrenched corruption, has played as big a part in politics? You've got to go back to the beginning of the 18th century, to Robert Walpole. But then, ladies and gentlemen, it worked. The government worked. Okay, by our standards, it was corrupt, but it was highly effective. It powered extraordinary economic growth, the beginnings of empire and everything else. What's extraordinary about this And it's the second point I want to make. This is not the corruption, it's the collapse. It's the speed of the collapse. Can you imagine if we go back, you and I met at the moment at which it was clear that the Conservatives were going to fail. The only question was, how big a majority would Labour have? Labour gets an enormous majority because, again, I've just mentioned the word dishonesty and lying. It lied. It lied that it would do as little as possible in terms of tax raising and everything else. It will be a government, to remember, that would tread lightly upon us. My God, before it put its hobnail boots on and gave them to Angela Rayner. But the real point is how quickly it's failed. A majority of 170 odd, you'll tell me the exact figure. What is the majority? 174.
Well, they've lost a few since.
No, they've lost. It's already eroded a little bit, hasn't it? With a prime minister who absolutely believes in this whole governmental structure and still can't make it work. So we have a system which is corrupt, which is based on lying, which is based on manipulation, which is based on deceit, which still doesn't work. And what we've got to do now is to explain that this isn't just a surface moral corruption. It's not just Petey or whatever he is, and you're in a little flavor of international finance and pederasty. It's something absolutely fundamental, and something fundamental that's gone wrong.
Mm-hmm. And David, this is where I want us to launch into your analysis of what has gone wrong across our politics over the past 25 years or so and how we fix it. And this is how we got to know each other. I set up PopCon, Popular Conservatism, in February 2024, almost exactly 2 years ago. And this was at a time when it seemed to me, as David has already mentioned, it was absolutely obvious the Conservatives were going to be destroyed in the general election. The only question was the scale of the massacre. But what the essay question I was grappling with was, given that the Conservatives were about to lose the election after 14 years in power, why on earth was it that in the period 2010 to 2024, 14 years of Conservative rule, 5 different Conservative prime ministers, albeit one of them in coalition with the Liberals, but why was it over that 14-year stretch, quite a long time for one party to be the governing party of our country, that Britain had not become more conservative in any aspect whatsoever? Pick your metric. Taxes. The tax burden went up. The flip side of that, spending, public spending at an all-time high. Debt and deficit out of control. No sound money. Regulation and red tape has spread like topsy. Cherished freedoms like freedom of speech have been diminished, whilst ludicrous, fancy, left-wing progressive projects like carbon net zero and women having penises has been embraced.
Sorry, can you rephrase that last statement? Yes. It's too disturbing, so early in the evening.
And so I was scratching my head about this. There's no, this is extraordinary that if you'd just taken a snapshot of Britain in 2010 and a snapshot of Britain in 2024, you would have assumed that we had had 14 years of a woke, leftist, socialist government. That was the direction the country went in. And I was asking myself why, and a good number of people obviously blame this on the frailties of our leading politicians, that it was all down to Boris's cake and Liz's lettuce and Rishi Sunak's absence of an umbrella when he called the general election, and they all should have been braver or stronger or wiser or calmer or whatever. But I suspected there was something much, much deeper, a more underlying problem, and that although people were understandably furious with the leading Conservatives as individuals, and I suspect today are furious with the leading lights of the Labour government as individuals, there is a bigger, deeper problem, irrespective of who is actually piloting the ship. And you helped me, I think, understand what that problem was and how to fix it. Tell our audience this evening what that problem is. What has gone fundamentally wrong that is bigger and deeper than the failings and the foibles of our politicians?
Right. I think there are two answers. The first is, Mark has already made a little bit of a joke about popular conservatism. The way I describe it is if only it were. We wouldn't be in the current mess that we are now. Now, Mark and I we've received a very, very warm, enthusiastic welcome here. We do, don't we, Mark, have to make a confession. We both remain members of the Conservative Party. The good, you're doing the right thing. It should be much more hiss, boo, get the buggers off. But ladies and gentlemen, I've been frank with you. You're now going to be frank with me. How many of you have been members of the Conservative Party? You keep your hands up. How many of the rest of you have voted Conservative? No. So everybody who's either a member of the Conservative Party or has voted. So most people in the room, right? So we're all in the same pickle. What we're dealing with is a split in the nature of conservatism. It's a dispute as to what the nature of conservatism is. This is why reform has happened, why it needed to happen. Let's be completely clear on it. Now, I think the long issue is the nature of conservatism itself, going right back to the beginning of conservatism in the 19th century, in 1835, when, not terribly far from here, Robert Peel launches the Tamworth Manifesto, the foundation document, the first time you actually use the word conservative.
And the Tories became conservative.
The Tories become conservative because Toryism had been completely defeated in the Great Reform Act of 1832 and the preceding legislation which gave civil rights to Roman Catholics. And at that point, Toryism has gone. But the Tamworth Manifesto, Robert Peel, begins by saying, I accept this huge change. The question then becomes, why do you ever stop accepting change? And this is the problem. Conservatism in a progressive country. Where do you draw the line? Where do you stop? And I think only one of our politicians, only one of the leaders of the Conservative Party has ever come up with the right answer. He's not the greatest of our Conservative prime ministers, but he is a most extraordinary political thinker and by far the greatest leader of the party. That's Disraeli. And Disraeli, 30 years afterwards, in 1867, when he gives the vote to my ancestors, 1832 gave the vote to the kind of people who inhabited Tewkesbury, the prosperous middle-class trader and that kind of thing. My ancestors, my father was a tool maker.
Really was. This is true.
I always say he did a much better job than Keir Starmer's, but that's we shan't investigate that. We shan't investigate the anatomy of that. Anyway, but there we are. But he was the skilled working class who were enfranchised by the 1867 Reform Act. And the man who does that is Disraeli, the leader of the Conservative Party. And when he's justifying that extraordinary change, and remember, it's giving the skilled working class the vote that makes conservatism the more or less permanent governing party of the late 19th and 20th century. That's what happens. And Disraeli explains it brilliantly. He starts off by saying, Britain is a progressive country. Remember, there's this incredible paradox. We are the country that invents modernity, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the extraordinary idea of self-government and everything else, all invented here. At the same time, we're rather a conservative place. It's a strange paradox. And Disraeli understands it. And what he says is, in a progressive country, change is inevitable. And you know what? If you actually look in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, just like the mainstream media, they cut the quote off at that point. In other words, it makes Disraeli sound like David Cameron. It makes it sound like David Cameron. You know, the only purpose of conservatism is, you know, to be terribly trendy and keep up with the times. But what Disraeli does is something completely different. He says, the question is not will there be change, but what kind of change? change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions and customs of the country? Good. Or is it change in accordance, and this is 1867, he uses these words, the rootless principles of international liberalism, what we call globalism. And the catastrophe of the years from 2010 onwards is that David Cameron bought into that settlement, that international liberal settlement, which had been imposed on Britain by Tony Blair.
And this is what
This is the key, in other words, that we experienced. And again, it's really important we understand this. We're mentioning Mandy, we're mentioning Petey, and he co-wrote a book with, again, a former leading member of your party. Is it Roger Liddell or Richard Liddell?
Liddell, yeah.
Roger Liddell, which was called the Blair Revolution. And do you know what? Blair did carry out a revolution. It's a slow burn French revolution in which completely alien principles are introduced into English government. And you now have a government and an administration at war with itself. You've got the two elements, the traditional structures of our government, which we'll discuss in a moment, at war with these completely alien elements like universal human rights, like the Equality Act, like the aggressive role of judges, like the multitude of quangos and everything else.
So let's go back to 1997 and the rise of Blair. And I'm trying to remember back to that point. As you know, as I'm fond of telling people, I'm in my late 40s. Well, my very late 40s. Yeah. Well, I'm 53, so my very, very late 40s. So I can remember back to 1997. And I did not vote for Blair, and I've never voted for the Labour Party. But I can remember when he won in 1997, I was spectacularly relaxed about it. I kind of thought, okay, the other side have won, but seems a basically moderate person. It looks like he has embraced the Thatcherite consensus. He's not going to nationalise the commanding heights of the economy. He's not going to put the top rate of tax up to 98%. This is insofar as there is an acceptable centre-lefty politician, this man is it. And we had Clinton on the other side of the pond as well, kind of low tax, pro-market. Petey himself said he was absolutely fine with people getting stinking rich.
You've not quoted correctly.
As long as they pay their taxes.
No, filthy rich is really important. And in retrospect, did he choose his words carefully?
So anyway, the Blair project comes in on a tide of enthusiasm with, again, an exhausted Conservative Party eviscerated at the polls. And nothing, although I wasn't rooting for the Labour Party, there was nothing particularly disturbed me about them. All this seems fair enough, fine enough. I can sleep soundly in my bed at night without worrying that my country's going to the dogs. Yet, if you like, behind the scenes, or without too many of us noticing, Blair went about his business in resetting the way Britain is governed. Isn't that right?
That's right.
It wasn't an enormous part of public debate, but it was happening, almost like a great magician. You don't really see the important parts of the act. You just see the way that the magician is distracting you with whatever tax cuts and sound money. But behind the scenes, the bit that we weren't watching on the stage was a complete reset of the British Constitution. Tell us what he did.
That's correct. And remember, it wasn't only you who was deceived, so was Margaret Thatcher. Mm-hmm. In 2002, she says Blair is her best monument to the continuing of liberal free market economics and whatever. But what Blair did, and what Mandelson in that remark was in his kind of slithery way was doing, was saying that yes, we're going to let that economic system run, and indeed we are going to run it hot, which is exactly what they did. The extreme financialization of the economy, some of it was already suggested under Thatcher, but it takes off vastly greater under Blair and Brown. But what they determined to do instead was to alter the way in which politics worked. So the economy continued. The politics shifted radically. And I think this, again, is where you and I have got very different origins. You were essentially an economist, and when we first met, when I said to you that I actually think that politics and the Constitution is prior to the economy, you were very surprised. And then we debated and argued, and I think I've essentially persuaded you of my position. So Blair keeps the surface going, but alters the foundations. And this is what we've got to understand. The key understanding of why I mentioned this extraordinary achievement of Britain, actually it's really England, but don't tell the Scots, but there we are. This extraordinary achievement of creating modernity rests not on the fact we had an industrial revolution, but that we were the first country at scale, to use that awful modern term, in other words, on the scale of a nation state, to achieve representative self-government. In other words, that the governed somehow that the governors answer to the governed. And it's done through this extraordinary thing called Parliament, which really does go back to 800 years, to the immediate aftermath of Magna Carta, in which the laws passed in Parliament, which includes, of course, the king, the church, the nobles, the leading gentry, the knights of the shire, and the representatives of the towns. In other words, everybody. Laws made by everybody bind everybody.
We participate fully in the process.
We participate in the making of law, which again, going back to Robert Peel, is why you were able to have a civilian police force. You were able to have the idea of unarmed police, because the laws are yours, and we are a uniquely law-abiding people, which is why we're taken to the cleaners so frequently. Right, what Blair did, Blair loathed that structure. Blair loathed as indeed the whole of the Labour Party, with the cancellation of elections, the repression of jury trial. We've seen the lot. They profoundly disapprove of anything in which the governors are directly responsible to the governed. And what Blair does subtly and cleverly is to take power away from anybody who is actually elected. And you divert it in two main directions. First, to experts, these extraordinary groups known as quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, the quangos. You, because you're jolly good at figures, will remind me of the exact number of them.
444. I wish it was 666.
Yes, the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast. But the mark of the beast, remember, controls about a third of state expenditure. And you have got absolutely no control over any of that. And these bodies are deliberately designed, as with the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, deliberately designed not to be subject to any form of democratic control. That's the purpose. Now, when we talk about government by experts, I mean, there's a problem again, isn't it? And this is the remarkable thing about the Blair Revolution. When you explain it in one sense, it sounds reasonable. What could be more reasonable than government by experts? You know, those people were really, really knowledgeable. Well, fortunately, and indeed, there's actually in traditional political thought, right, the two great Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Plato does believe in government by experts, the philosopher kings. It's Aristotle. I think you know, there's the wonderful line in Gilbert and Sullivan about everybody that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. I think you're either a Platonist or you're an Aristotelian, even if you don't know it. Because Aristotle has this wonderful phrase, the judge of a meal is not the cook, it's the eater. And that's how politics should be seen.
That's how democracy.
That's the origin of representative government and democracy. That's exactly how it should be seen. But we had a model from in fact, what you said, the period of conservative rule that illustrates precisely the danger of the rule by experts. It's COVID. We were actually ruled by a committee of experts. I was going to call them Scientologists. I think they were actually called scientists of the sage. I mean, look at the name, sage. I mean, just like Plato's philosopher kings. What is the problem? Those scientists, the epidemiologists, remember they're very expert, but they have one task, which is to stop anybody dying of COVID. What do they decide to do? Shut down the entire NHS, shut down its coronary units, its cancer units, the lot, because it was more important to stop anybody dying of COVID. So the result is we destroy the basis of both cancer care, coronary care, and virtually everything else, and they've never recovered. Not only do we do that, we decide it's so important that we stop people dying of COVID. And by the way, does everybody remember what the average age of death from COVID was? 81, 82 or 83, and the average age of death is 81. So as I pointed out, get COVID, live longer. But it's true. It is actually true. Once you dare like the little boy with the naked emperor, once you actually dare to question. But in order to stop people, the elderly, dying, we decided to shut down the whole of society, including schools. The result is we destroy the educational opportunities of 3 generations of school children. We go beyond that in order to do of that, to close down society. We had to borrow, was it between 400 and 500 billion?
Furlough cost 400 billion.
And then there was furlough. I mean, the cost, in other words, of a major war. And we get nothing from it. And this is the direct illustration of rule by the one issue expert committee. It's why you have the insanity of English nature insisting on a bat tunnel for HS2, costing, 100 million. As I point out, you could build 3 bat Ritzes and each one of the buggers a butler for a bat butler for the same price. It's demented.
Yeah, it comes out at £500,000 per bat.
Per bat. I mean, this is simply insanity. All the grotesque costs of the alleged restoration of Parliament. This is the result of single-issue experts. And you know what? The 2 of the greatest politicians of the 20th century, one at the beginning, the other in the middle years, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt in America, and Winston Churchill in Britain, both were very fond of employing experts, in particular scientists. But you know what they say? You want your scientists on tap, but not on top. And this is the problem. We've created a governmental structure in which single-issue experts are on top, which is why there are so many insane decisions. So that's one half of the Blair project.
Can you give us, I mean, obviously COVID is probably in terms of sheer costs and dramatic effect, the biggest. You've mentioned Natural England, as it called, and the bat tunnel. Give us a few others that, I mean, because there's 400 of these.
There were 400 of them.
I mean, the Sentencing Guidance Council comes to mind.
The Sentencing Guidance Council.
So the Justice Secretary doesn't issue now guidance?
No, it's done by a committee of judges who accrue to themselves a kind of, they draw a sacred robe around themselves. What is a mere politician daring to intervene into this? This is intolerable. The judges, yes, judge in an individual case, but they shouldn't be setting general rules.
Yeah, and
there's been a complete confusion of these things. But wherever you look in government, the multitude of regulation, the absurdity. I mean, I was hearing, wearing my hat as a historian, I was at Hever Castle last night. May I do a big plug? We've got a wonderful exhibition on the image of Anne Boleyn opening up. But they've been having major problems with local planners. They were saying, they want to extend part of the building. It comes near a very small artificial lake. It is then discovered that there may be newts in this lake. At which point, the planning authority consults experts who say, oh yes, there may be newts, terribly dangerous. At which point, they have to consult another lot of experts who argue that there, well, probably aren't too many. And we go backwards. There's an absurdity. This is why you can't build anything or do anything. Or rather, it's one half of the story. The other half of the story is how all this regulation is enforced, which is by new legal structures, which again is the Blair creation. Because one half of Blair was to
give away all this power
give it to the expert. But the other half of it was to impose on us a completely new, foreign and dangerous legal structure in which the relationship between Parliament, I mean, we're talking about on tap and on top. Traditionally in England, Parliament is on top, and judges enforce the laws made by Parliament by consent. What happened under Blair, increasingly, that relationship is reversed. So judges effectively accrue to themselves the right of final authority, and popular lawmaking is denigrated and mocked. And what we've got to do is to, analyze that process and again look at the whole issue of language, because I think that one of the things we failed on the right, we failed completely on language. We've let the left, the devil has all the best tunes, and we've let the left, it's a tongue twister, I apologize, we've let the left steal all the best words. The key thing, of course, is human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, how could anybody possibly object to them? I say it's a kind of Paddington Bear idea. You can just see human rights, can't you, with the little battered red hat and the sweet little luggage label in that old-fashioned buff round the neck, the little battered suitcase, and everybody, particularly the women, go, there's terrible sentimentality. But can we ask what the idea of either European human rights or universal human rights, why is it so dangerous when it sounds so nice? Well, think about it for a second. If you believe there are universal human rights, you believe, ladies and gentlemen, and many of you may do, I won't embarrass you by asking you to put your hands up this time. It's a jolly good teaching technique. But if you believe there are universal human rights, you believe, as the left does, as Polanski does, and as Philippe Sands does, you believe there's a universal human being. You believe we're all basically just the same. And you take a newly landed immigrant from Afghanistan or the Middle East, and you give him a shower, and you tidy up the beard, and you remove the odd Kalashnikov, and within 5 minutes, he's just like you and me, And he spends his Sunday afternoons, playing cricket and drinking a nice beer around the village pond, doesn't he? Well, we know that's not true. But we've now got a structure of law that pretends that's
And David,
true.
tell us about how this has become more powerful. So on the quangos, I get it.
Yeah.
They control a third of government's expenditure.
Yeah.
Most government regulation.
Yeah.
But here on the human rights side, the lawyer's side, the judge's side, give me some examples of how power is in their hands today in a way that it wouldn't have been 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Well, what happens is, because we incorporate the European Convention of Human Rights in 1998 into a common law system. Remember, common law judges, because of our whole separate historical tradition from continental Europe, you take law very seriously. You take it literally. Continental judges are just used to dealing with general propositions. If you actually look at the various clauses of the human rights, of the European Convention on Human Rights, you will see very abstract notions like a right to family life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you can make what the hell you want out of a phrase like that. And when the convention was first signed in 1951, you still were at the end of the Attlee government. And you know what? The Attlee government was profoundly skeptical about signing it. The then Labour Lord Chancellor said, this is going back to the worst days of Chancery when the law varied with the length of the Chancellor's foot. It's so loosely drafted, judges will be able to drive a coach and horses through it. But it's only once it's incorporated into British English law that this really happens. Hence the astonishing shift in our attitudes to, not legal attitudes, to immigration in particular, to group rights, and so on. And this is the disaster.
So, I mean, I've said if you want to impact immigration policy in the UK, you're far better to become a judge than a member of Parliament.
That is absolutely true. And again, we were talking about the business of the quangos. One of the other strange things is the way all this knits together. Now, again, I'm not going to ask the awkward question about special educational needs, but the reason, in other words, how many of your children have them and how many of you campaign for them, the reason that is so deadly dangerous is that the law gives an individual right to a child who is assessed with special educational needs, irrespective of any concerns of budget. You also have a tribunal which assesses the liability, or rather the right to individual rights, with the judges increasingly just saying yes, yes, yes. So it's completely impossible to impose any kind of budgetary control on the thing, because this is going back again to COVID. All government is a matter of balancing things against each other. But law is not a matter of balancing practicalities. Law is, this is either right or it's wrong. Mm-hmm. There is no balance. And human rights law pays no attention whatever to the cost. To cost. It pays no attention whatever to the rights of the majority against the minority. It pays no attention whatever to practicalities. It pays no attention to public safety or to the national interest. Now, this is the catastrophe that we've landed ourselves into. And again, it's really important. This wasn't just slipped through. There was a very serious campaign at a very high level of the legal profession, led by a man called Tom Bingham, who at that point was the senior law lord. And he was completely clear that bringing in the Human Rights Act would fundamentally change the nature of law. Up to that point, law is what we think it should be, weighing the claims of one individual against another individual according to abstract rules. What Bingham wanted to do, what Blair wanted to do, what Brown wanted to do, was to make law an instrument of social justice. In other words, socialist policies. And you do it, that's exactly what's been visited on us. Bingham, when he was lecturing on this in Australia, is completely clear. Listen to what he says. Human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic. It is counter-majoritarian, and it's biased in favor of minorities against the majority. And he lists the minorities. They begin, ladies and gentlemen, with gypsies and the mentally sick. There is absolutely no accident about Rudakabana and Kalokane. The fact that these people who should have been in restrained care because of their psychopaths from about the age of 13 are left free to wander and murder. The law says it. Well, you're talking about the Sentencing Council. The Sentencing Council was determined, and I think will still get through with that despite political resistance, to say that anybody who belongs to any sort of minority whatever, in other words, anybody who's not white, male, and straight, is going to receive softer sentencing than people who are white, male, and straight. This is outrageous. It's intolerable. It goes against the entire tradition of common law and equality before the law.
Okay, so what's happened here is that Blair gave away vast amounts of parliamentary democratic power in two directions. One, to hundreds upon hundreds of these expert bodies who were beyond the reach of public deliberately. Yeah. So the experts are deciding about the welfare of bats and all the rest of it, and lockdowns and closing down schools and totally changing the health service to deal with COVID. So on the one hand, a huge amount of power goes out of the door in that direction. And on the other hand, out of another door in a different direction, we give enormous political power to our judges in interpreting what constitutes the right to a private life, for sake of argument, the Equalities Act, judicial interpretation.
Why Birmingham is bankrupt? Why Birmingham is bankrupt? Because the Equality Act staggeringly contains the Marxist Labour theory of value. I mean, it's completely insane.
So all of that power goes out to judges, and we politicise the law, basically. So decisions about immigration and equal pay are now made in courts.
Again, can I just give you another big, again, also the thing to understand, Mark, and the thing that's vital, and is going to condition how we deal with this, the two sides of it support each other. So, for example, with Theresa May, again, we haven't made the point about the Conservatives doubling down on this. When she introduces by statutory instrument, the target of 2050 for net zero, that means net zero is legally binding. That means it is judges who determine whether or not you can drill in the North Sea. It is judges who determine whether or not you can frack. This is insane. Yep. It is judges again.
These are political decisions.
These should be political decisions. It's again, look at Birmingham, judges set wages. This is madder than anything pre-Thatcher when you had prices and incomes boards. So, it is literally deranged politics, and we are reaping the consequences.
So is this a fair précis of the Starkey thesis then? That the Blair government gave away huge amounts of democratic power to these expert bodies on the one hand, to the judiciary and the law on the other, making judges decide issues that should rightly be decided by politicians, leaving Parliament somewhat emasculated. It can still decide things, but it no longer has the power to do so in a vast range of areas. What needs to be done? Because it seems to me that out there amongst the great British public is an anger, a disappointment, a genuine concern about where the country's going. But it's not going to be enough just to replace the Starmer cabinet with a Farage cabinet or a Badenoch cabinet or some other cabinet. Right?
Absolutely true.
So as and when and if this government falls and there's a general election, what needs to be done to put things right if it's not just a question of replacing Keir Starmer with a different individual?
Let's just introduce one hugely important point, bringing it back to Mandelson. If you remove all this power to experts on the one hand and lawyers on the other, what does the purpose of politics become? It simply becomes manipulating public opinion and feeding people the noble lies of diversity is our strength. Britain has always been a nation of immigrants. We have 5 minutes to save the planet, all of this stuff. And that is why Mandelson was so important. It's why Campbell is so important. It's why this whole business of comms is so important. Politics ceases to be about anything real. It becomes a language game, which is why it's so profoundly prostrating. Now, how do we break out of this trap? Well, you break out of this trap as another politician who found herself in a very similar position. Margaret Thatcher found herself in a position in 1979 where, just as now, there had been long periods of conservative rule which hadn't made Britain more conservative because the Conservatives had stopped being conservative. What she realized was you to break the consensus. She broke the consensus on Keynesian economics. She breaks the consensus on nationalization, on trade union rights. She undoes law before she does anything. She knew what she had to break, including the National Union of Mine Workers. What we've got to be clear of, what a reform government, a conservative government, whatever, restore, whatever it is, we've to be clear that there's an enormous exercise of cutting away this dead wood that I've talked about. I call it the Great Repeal. Basically, all the Blairite constitutional and legal legislation has got to be undone. And until we break this structure, we'll never recover. And going back to the point about economics, Mark, the reason that our economy is frozen is in a large part due to this. It cuts in two ways. Because of the structure of the quangos and legal enforcement, most welfare is actually quasi-legally enforced. It's a matter of right, which is why the bills keep going up and uncontrollably up. It's again, if we look at the whole absurdities of immigration policy, you can't break it because it's legally fixed. And before then, we can get any of this under control, any of it politically or economically under control. We've to recognize, I'm afraid we've got to smash. But there's something really important. This is not a revolution. This is a counter-revolution. This is restoring. This is bringing back what's been taken away. You make the point terrifically about MAGA, Make America Great Again. It's that sense that things have been taken away. It's one of the reasons, I think, why you're all here. All of you know, and for once it's true, it's not just sentiment, it's not just the grass was greener on the other side of the hill. Things, aspects of them were better. The state did work better. And it's really important we understand this and advance this argument against our enemies. The new is not always the best. Very often it's cheap and trashy and bits of plastic that break. If things have been around 700 years, there's a jolly good reason for it. They've worked. And we've lost that argument again. Blair was the believer in novelty, novelty, novelty. Ooh, twiddly widdly, you know, this absurd business. Britain's a new country. Do you remember he said new country? Well, he made us. But it turned out to be Ratner. It turned out to be gimcrack. It was trash.
So
we've to smash the Ratner.
So what needs to be done? Am I right? Let's just say reform win the next general election.
Right. The other thing that
they might have a whole load of plans about, I don't know, how to reduce the welfare bill, how to smash the gangs, how to, I don't know, make the NHS more efficient, whatever it might be, which taxes they wish to reduce to keep pubs open. All of that's well and good. But is what you're saying actually in their first 100 days, perhaps first 100 weeks, the colossal battle an incoming government needs to be engaged in is to bring forward a bill that becomes an act of parliament that repeals the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, the Constitutional Reform Act.
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. That we leave ECHR. We probably have to exit some parts of the Refugee Convention. That actually has to be the focus. And it sounds a bit constitutional and nebulous rather than helping the local landlord to sell more pints and bags of crisps to keep his pub open. But what you're saying is this, isn't it? If you don't do that, the rest is basically impossible.
You will not be able to do anything at all. Because again, the key to understand is that the whole Blairite structure of judges and quangos was designed to institute socialism in perpetuity. It was designed to cement it in, and it did it very, very effectively. But you know what? What's made by law can be undone by law. It's one of the things we need to grasp. But ladies and gentlemen, we need two things. We will need a prime minister of a level of skill, of determination, of iron backbone, such as we've not seen in at least 50 or 60 years. We will also need something else. We'll need a degree of seriousness of preparation, of thoroughness, of sorting out the legislative program, because the entire structure that I've been talking about, what we call the blob, will be against us. That is the case, and that's got to be understood. So we've got a model, and the model is on the other side of the Atlantic. It's Trump 1 and it's Trump 2. Trump 2 was a success, or is at least some important elements of it were a success because it's prepared for. He worked hard. If you actually look at that extraordinary scene at the beginning of Trump's second term, I'm sure we all watched it, that very brief swearing in the rotunda of the Capitol building, and then straight to the Oval Office. straight to the desk, and with that extraordinary figure, I call him Trump's Thomas Cromwell, except that Cromwell had the big hat on, and Stephen Miller is completely bald. There with that huge stack of executive orders, and Trump starts signing. We will have to have the equivalent of that. And those orders, I met quite recently one of the people involved in drafting them. The more important of them, the things on immigration and whatever, one man worked on one document for a year. That was the level of preparation. That's what we need.
So I'm going to finish with one more question, and then we're going to come over to the audience.
Yep.
Have you got a microphone there? You have. So consider your questions, put your hands in the air. I'm a very equal opportunities person. I'll take as many questions from that side of the room and this side of the room and the front and the back. But I just, as people are gathering their questions together, I'll take them 3 at a time as well. And if you don't mind saying who you are, where you're from, you may know each other, but David and I don't know you. And here are the rules. You can make a comment, you can give a speech, you can ask a question, but whatever you do, it must be no more than 1 sentence long.
No subclauses.
And it must end in a question mark. Those are the rules of protocol. But before, so do catch my eye, especially if you're at the back, wave in the air. But David, just as I'm going to select the questions, do you think that the leadership of Reform have basically understood this? Or do they consider your prognosis and your recipe to be sort of rather obscurantist, highfalutin, constitutional, rather nebulous sort of things that aren't really about winning an election? How much do you think this party has understood your analysis and prescription?
I think it's understood it. It doesn't yet prioritize it. And I mean, it's very understandable why you're a new beast. It's always, of course, in a political party, the important thing is the next election, the next event, and whatever. But until one actually recognizes the need to take the long-term plan, if you look at Thatcher, the reason Thatcher succeeded, insofar as she did, which was very considerable, was for 4 years, people planned. People organized. People looked, the whole idea of how you took on the miners, the need to stockpile coal. I was there as a very young man at some of those conversations, not really understanding them by the pure coincidence. These were my very early days in television, and I was in the circle of a very, very strange, extraordinary man called Anthony Blonde, who you can tell how extraordinary he was. He's the only member of the Marks and Spencer's family who was poor, but he happened to have a very beautiful house next door to the Spectator, and on one side of the wall you'd have people like Enoch Powell and the strange David, what was he called? The man who always wore riding breeches and long boots, who organized the dirty side of Thatcher's campaign. And I sat there thinking, my God! And the two fat ladies were doing the cooking. It was an extraordinary period of very extraordinary period of my life. But they did the preparation. They did the work.
Yeah.
They
didn't make it up, so they went along.
That's right.
So, David, the first one was about the coercive nature of government. I'm going to bend that question somewhat in my own direction. Yes, of course, the state has the monopoly on coercive force. But I think it's now starting to use it in a rather sinister fashion, right? It's not that you get a knock on the door and you're taken down the salt mine or done away with. It's that you're gently told not to tweet like that.
Yeah, you're advised.
Police officers look at your bookshelf and say, "Ooh, a rather Brexity collection of books." This was, by and large, how East Germany was policed. I mean, some people were taken out and shot, but very, very few. It was this rather more sinister, soft power of, I'm not sure I'd say that if I were you type thing. What do you make of how the state has used that sort of force in recent years compared to times gone by?
I think it's increased very markedly, and there's a reason for it. There's a general argument now that was first really seriously advanced by my friend and colleague Neil Ferguson that the structure of our government now resembles late Soviet Union. And another version of the argument was put forward by Mark Carney at Davos when he quoted from Václav Havel, the greengrocer in the dying days of communist Czechoslovakia, who puts "Workers of the World Unite" in his empty shop window, you know, where there's one half rotting potato and a shriveled tomato. And those were slogans nobody believed in, but everybody had to pretend to believe in them. Now, I would argue that diversity is our strength, that Britain is a nation of immigrants, that immigrants are automatically of economic value and so on. These are exactly the same as Workers of the World Unite.
They're noble lies.
They're noble. They are, well, they are lies. The degree of nobility depends on the eye of the observer. By the way, it's Plato who coins the phrase, the noble lie. The point is, and this is where Mandelson comes in. This is what I began by saying at the beginning. Government now is manipulation. It's comms. That's why you had a nudge unit that began under Cameron and then emerged so powerfully under in COVID.
This was to do things like not have chocolate near a supermarket till.
And all of that stuff. But the more, as it were, Oslot start doing the routine I've already mentioned, the little boy saying the emperor's got no clothes, the more there is the dissent, the more again there is, again, our chairman introducing us talked about the online presence that Mark and I have, the fact that there is a world which is largely escaped from control. One of the reasons that the right is looking much brighter than it did remember, the absolute peak of woke is not coincidentally, COVID and BLM in the summer of 2020, when the entire world goes mad. What is it that really breaks all that? Well, it's partly the reaction to the absurdities, again, talking about coercion. Look at COVID. Look at the extent of the extension of the coercive powers of the state during COVID. But I think that
at a trivial level as well. How many times a day can you walk your dog?
I mean, completely and again, I'm not going to ask people to put their hands up. How many turned out to bang their bloody saucepans for our NHS, you know, and all of that stuff. I mean, it would be rude to remind people of their behaviour at that moment. And there's that wonderful phrase of one of our very, very greatest historians when he says, "There is nothing as absurd as the British public in one of its fits of morality." Yeah. It was a fit of morality. Anyway, but the person who breaks all that is Elon Musk. When Musk goes into Twitter with that kitchen sink, that's the moment that the monopoly of the media is broken. That's the moment that Trump would have not been elected without it. I wouldn't be sitting here without it. And it's this possibility of rebellion. That means you need more coercion. And we're going to see more of it as the blob desperately tried to keep control. So the question was essential. But there's no accident. All of this fits, you know, a good explanation. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. This is just what any good historian does. You look at something and you try to come up with a broad, overarching pattern of interpretation. We can see it.
I won't say who it was, but I had lunch just before Christmas with someone who was a very senior cabinet minister in the last Conservative governments. And his view was that if reform prevailed at the election, although you would get a lot of pushback from the civil service and the quangos, the biggest battle will be the House of Lords, in which there is precisely one reform peer at the moment who defected from the Conservatives. And they will use every trick in the book, and they're masters at it, to frustrate a reform manifesto. I know there's the Salisbury Convention, that if it's in the manifesto, the Lords are not supposed to block it, but they will endeavour to do so. They are also wholly intertwined with the Quango state. All of these people sit
and
on
indeed the judicial state
England
and the judicial state. Yeah.
So it's their very livelihoods at stake. And with presently one reform peer, you can see the battle. Even if reform were wholly persuaded of the Starkey thesis, it is going to face colossal pushback from the House of Lords as presently constituted. What is to be done?
Not reform, that's a waste of time at the moment. As happened again in 1832, as happened in 1910 with the Parliament Act, which enables the passing of the 1906 budget and whatever, you would have to have the King's agreement to a mass creation of peers. It's as simple as that.
So you put in like 600 reform peers?
Or whatever number it takes.
Is that uncontroversial, or would
it would be hugely controversial. You would have peers dying in the street, as far as I'm concerned. The more, the better. But that's we mustn't get careful. I'm breaking my rule. I want it all to be very gentlemanly and British and peaceful. On the other hand, it might not be, in which case tough. There we are.
So your solution would be a mass creation.
I think that.
The manifesto is passed.
What happened in both 1832 and 1910 was the threat. Combined with direct messages from the palace that the threat would be carried out, meant that the mass creation didn't need to take place.
But it needed to be credible.
I suspect it needed to be credible. I suspect, because I wouldn't trust these people further than I could throw them, which, bearing in mind how bloated most of them are with both money and flab, wouldn't be very far. I think the mass creation may have to go ahead.
Okay.
You would at least, again, you'd need at least a solid phalanx of 200. But there's another really important issue. These would just not be lobby fodder. You would actually need substantial people. And one of the enormous challenges of reform, and again, I don't want to interfere with private grief. As you know, there's been a huge discussion about bringing former Conservative ministers over and whatever, but you do need substantial and weighty people. People who know how it works and people who know how to change it. Now, the question of where they're best recruited from is another question, but you need that. What a very interesting question. And I have to say, I am profoundly disturbed by the pattern which the present reign has taken. I think that the king has been profoundly misguided in his apparent favoritism to Islam. I think it was profoundly misguided. I think on the other hand, that there are ways in which that could be done to advantage. Now, I know what I'm going to say now sounds absolutely extraordinary. I would actually make Islam an established religion. In other words, I would then impose state control on it. I would do exactly what's done in the UAE or Saudi Arabia. I would, and in the same way, I'd revive state control of the Church of England and remove the present absurd archiepiscopissa. That is actually the proper Latin term for a female bishop. It was usually the wife of a bishop, but I think episcopissa is a wonderful word, isn't it? But the Church of England has got out of control because you should never let priests govern themselves. It's always the silliest one who does it. But the monarchy is an essential part of what Disraeli was talking about, with that tradition and custom. The trouble is that the king, and I think even the queen before him, she is by no means entirely free of blame on this. Her ridiculous fascination with the Commonwealth is one of the reasons that we have figures like Lammy and the whole fuss about reparations and whatever. The Commonwealth should have been gently put to bed a very, very long time ago. Five Eyes, yes. The old white Commonwealth, but the general Commonwealth should have been forgotten about a very long time ago. It's simply a vehicle for reparations. But the essential point of our monarchy, since 1689, it is a parliamentary monarchy. The monarch is the head of the overall political structure, and it desperately needs one. You have at the moment Lindsay Hoyle. Who takes him seriously, this semi-half-educated, Labour backbencher who can barely speak English? I mean, what a symbol is that of our politics? But once again, it requires what has happened quite a few times in the history of our monarchy, that the king has gently got to be redirected.
I would not abolish the Bank of England, right? I think that we need to have a Bank of England. I would, however, put it under considerably more political control, but probably not total political control. So there's one quangle I would maintain. But essentially, I would take the list of all 400 or so of them, and Reform should do this. Danny Chris should do this. I've invited him to do it. And you look at them from the Advertising Standards Agency to Natural England to the Environment Agency to Ofcom, and you look at all of their functions, and you ask, okay, which of these functions can actually just be abolished? We don't care about this function at all. You might, for example, decide that you don't believe that fairness and balance in television broadcasting needs to be a rule at all, that you just have competing television stations. So that can just be scratched out. You might have some that can be privatised, possibly. I could potentially see certain elements of Ofcom regulation could be handed over to a body of the television companies, self-regulation. I think there'd be a bit of that, but not much. And then for anything where you wish to retain the function, let's say flood defence, a function of the Environment Agency, you put that into the relevant department under total ministerial control. You might even call that a kind of plan of nationalisation in some ways, but it's actually a plan of politicisation. So yes, Britain needs flood defences. I suppose you could have an interesting argument about whether the free market could provide that through some form of insurance rather than the state. But if you decide, no, the state needs to provide that, then the flood defence part of the Environment Agency goes into the Department of the Environment and is directly answerable to the Environment Minister, or perhaps the Flooding Minister. And you chalk off every single function of every single quango, leaving a very limited amount in independent control. I can imagine some functions of the Bank of England not being directly controlled by the Chancellor. Well, it hasn't got any diversity at all. They're all Keynesian economists on the Monetary Policy Committee. That goes to David's point, I think, if you want your experts on tap but not on top. So I don't have an objection to the Justice Secretary having experts on whether sentencing policy in Britain is working well or not, whether it's fair or not, whether there are changes to it that might
After all, you run a think tank.
Yeah.
You run a think tank.
That seems to be eminently sensible. I'm not suggesting that the Justice Secretary has the answer to anything. You want to everything. You want your cabinet ministers to be able to access that contradictory advice and then make a decision. So that's how I'd go through all 444, the lot of them. And virtually nothing would be standing as a state-financed independent body, virtually nothing. What's your take on that?
I mean, pretty well the same. I mean, I would introduce another measure. One of the areas that we most need reconstructing is proper local government. We are unique in the withering of our local government. The one good thing that the French Revolution did was to create the commune and the local mayor. The disaster of making our local government ever more remote, ever bigger. There are certain things where size is indeed important. But I mean, my experience of this, and I think it's really a fundamental issue. We haven't talked about it, and I'll take this opportunity to do so. I have the experience of living for many years in a little American town I had a holiday home on the banks of the Chesapeake in Maryland. Little tiny colonial town of about 5 streets in one direction and 4 in another. The whole core was essentially 18th century. And that little town still ran, as I remember my little town, slightly bigger town. Chestertown was about 5,000. Kendal, when I was a boy, was about 20. Both of them ran their own fire brigade. It was an amateur fire brigade, but it was perfectly adequate to most of the situations of a little town like that. They had their own police forces. They had their own school boards. And you know what? I think we should do that. It's not the most efficient way of doing it, but it takes most account of the fact that local communities are very different. And you also want people who fundamentally care. The sheer neglect of our towns and villages is hideous. The sense of decay of public buildings is shocking, and particularly if you look at the legacy that we were left by the Victorians and the Edwardians, or even to the 1930s. Splendid structures. The meanness now, the trash, the decay. Again, it's all Blairite. I mean, everything looks like, you know, a cheap deal from IKEA, and it's just awful.
And then the second question from Martin was, you sort of said, I think, thank you for the analysis, but where's the prescription? I did move on to that at the end, that we need some kind of great repeal act or a series of acts that repeal these legislative structures that have been brought in. And there'll be a whole range of different ways. Some of this will be parliamentary legislation. Some can be done by orders in council. Some can be done under statutory instruments. It needs to be mapped, I think, as David was saying, in the way that the second Trump administration prepared for it. And it is a lot of very diligent and important work. But I'm going to derive from Martin's point about the message. I mean, I make no apology that David and I go around giving this analysis, because my impression is that there isn't yet a majority of even the politically active who accept the diagnosis that we've put forward. And if you don't accept that, until we can persuade people of the diagnosis, it's extremely difficult to persuade them of the surgery. But what's the message, do you think, that would really echo throughout the land and make the next election almost a referendum on a constitutional reset? You mentioned Make America Great Again. Obviously, the referendum had take back control, going back.
I think what we've got to get over is Brexit was the first expression of this, the people sort of saying the emperor's got no clothes. It was deliberately defeated and delayed as far as possible by the blob, showing exactly how they would treat the more serious endeavor that I've been discussing. Now, I think we need something like the Vote Leave campaign. We need an organized campaign of explanation and of persuasion. And I think that if the structures of politics and whatever continue moving as they're doing now, I think there will be sufficient people with sufficient means that it will be possible to do that. And I'm convinced we will win. Well, I think, Cummings is precisely the kind of awkward shit that it's jolly important to have. That you need grit in the oyster needs grit. And Cummings must have been, can you imagine trying to work with him? Can you imagine what he smelt like in the office? You know, but he was knobbly, he was awkward, he was difficult, he was intelligent.
I think he's a genius.
Well, he's a genius, but he's also hideously wrong on some things. He was a great advocate of lockdown. Mm-hmm. And he, again, his great tutor at Oxford, Norman Stone, and I resumed our friendship after a 40-year gap, before Norman's death, actually during 2020. And Norman confided in me that Dominic's great problem had always been that he thought he understood mathematics. And this is a terrible, terrible danger. But no, he's a man, and again, there are one or two other people who emerged, and one of the figures, and I shan't mention his name because I don't think he wants to be particularly public, the man who provided the basis for the Starkey thesis, my understanding of this, was Dominic's closest colleague in Downing Street, and Dominic was actually best man at his wedding. And he was the man at the very center of trying to rescue the negotiations with David Frost to leave the EU. And it was from his, an extraordinary evening that I had with him I'd never met him, when he invited me to have supper with him so that he could, it was almost like we've been using this ecclesiastical language, evangelism and whatever. It was almost like confession. He wanted to talk to somebody about his experiences. And it's from that I've constructed the argument that I've done. And as anybody who's listened to Cummings will realize there's a tremendous overlap between the analysis that I've given and the analysis that Cummings gives.
We are taking on incredible vested interests in this battle who will not lay down willingly. I mean, am I right? Your answer, David, is, the law is the law is the law. And if you can change the law and therefore change, who wields the power, these people are rendered impotent. I mean, there's a question of the parliamentary battle of getting it through. We've touched on the House of Lords. We haven't touched on this evening, but we've often discussed whether you need a kind of majority of 100 or so rather than a majority of 6 to get all this done. But what's the pushback from the Blairites, Ben?
Well, I think we push back against the Blairites in exactly the way they push back against us. You use law on the one hand, and you use patronage brutally on the other. That what again, Gordon Brown deliberately destroyed in the last days of his ministry, the power of political patronage. Having packed everything himself, he then destroyed that power. We would restore it. We would take back to the Prime Minister control over Regius chairs in universities, bishops in the Church of England, the entire pattern insofar as you retain quangos, trusteeships of museums. There would be a complete clearing out, exactly as the Blairites did. And they would go into the wilderness. It's very simple. They would go into the wilderness. I would again take brutal control of the machinery of honours in exactly the same way they did. And they offered them. They offer as the precise example. The left has been ruthless in the deployment of the instruments of state. We've been feeble. We mentioned Jacob and the Starkey podcast. Jacob actually said on air, Boris thought it was indecent to use patronage to appoint conservatives. What the fuck? The essential purpose of government is the proper exercise of power. And it's insanity not to do it. I mean, if you look at the way in which I mentioned the great Robert Walpole. Walpole is the person who makes parliamentary government work, because parliaments are naturally unmanageable. It's why they're abolished in virtually every other country. He manages them by judiciously applied corruption and bribery, and the fondness of public office and people's vanity for orders and decorations. You use it ruthlessly.
This was a topic of one of your very...
It was indeed with David Betts. I mean, I think that there are some terrible signs. We have a police force, large sections of which have been taken over, have been penetrated. We need to admit this. We have got profound corruption in local government in certain areas. We have got a tiny army, which itself has undergone much wokery. And we have, as was seen, I'm afraid, in the reaction to the Southport riots, in some areas of the country, we effectively have Muslim militias. Now, they are terrifying. The whole flag campaign suggests a movement to what all that would point to, sectarian, factional politics, very much on the lines of Northern Ireland. But fortunately, it's still only in certain areas. I think we mustn't get ourselves carried away. I think it's still containable. I think maybe it's because I spend much of my time either in central London and more particularly in the east of Kent, which still feels to me pretty much to be what England did as areas around here, and so much of the country does. I think that heart, talking a bit sentimentally, but politics has a strong element of sentiment. I think the heartland is still there. Just. We can't be complacent, which is why, again, the next election is so crucial. Why, indirectly, to answer the next question, we cannot have the right split. There has to be some form of broad platform of agreement. Mark and I are very keen on the notion that you build it not by negotiating between the deeply incompatible and hostile personalities, but you try to build up a broad policy platform of the type that I'm talking about. And if you can get that broad basic agreement, then I would hope that the disagreements of personalities and whatever will dissolve. There has to be that broad right platform. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, the most likely thing, and it's truly terrifying, will be a multiple coalition, probably with Polanski as Prime Minister. That, I'm serious. I am absolutely serious. It is truly terrifying. A mating of Rayner and Polanski. Imagine what they produce. Yes,
but
right.
just to press you a bit further on this, David, because this is an issue I grapple with as well. Since the general election, the Conservatives have fallen back somewhat from what was already an incredibly low ebb.
Yeah.
Reform has been absolutely spectacular. Doubled their vote. My working assumption, I'm going to confess I got this wrong, was that at the last election, Reform were going to get a decent chunk of the vote because people were so irritated with how the Conservatives have behaved, and a large number of people wanted to vote for a party on the right of centre but weren't going to vote Conservative. And I then expected that to disperse. I expected that to be Reform's high watermark and it to be the low watermark for the Conservatives. The reverse has happened. On most projections, if there were an election held today, there would be a substantial Reform majority. Does the Conservative Party really have a role anymore, or shouldn't we just fold in with this lot?
I think, again, I've already mentioned the word, I mock sentiment on many occasions, but I do believe in an institution that has lasted for as long as the Conservative Party has done. I would hope it can be revived. It may prove that it is indeed dead. I think that the events of the next 4 or 5 months, because events are speeding up so much, such an extraordinary speed, I think they will make it absolutely clear. So to answer my honest reply to the gentleman who asked me about the Conservative, I'm a kind of sentimental residual adherent of the Conservative Party. My energies are completely elsewhere. They're doing this. And I see my role, insofar as I have one, and I'm not arrogant enough to think it's a major one. If it develops any further, it will be in the role of managing what might once upon a time have been called a think tank or something that would supervise the drafting of the constitutional legislation we're talking about that would be available to any government. And I will actually include a government of the left. I mean, intelligent people. I mean, McSweeney became absolutely persuaded of the need for doing some of the things that I've been talking about, which is why he got rid of Sue Gray, who wanted to take it all further. But that's how I see my role. Well, I don't think written constitutions do very much. The only written constitution that's ever really worked is that of America, because A, it's brilliantly drafted, and B, it simply incorporates previous traditions. That's why it's worked. Most written constitutions are simply so much glued on, which is why you look at France. France has had 5 republics, 2 empires, 2 monarchies, and a prince-president since 1789. The Constitution made absolutely no difference whatever. And written constitutions are really just the pieces of paper. And it's really important we understand this. I try to explain to people, we tend to think of the Constitution as being like a prescription. You know, you go to your doctor, he writes something out, and you know, the drugs pop out, and you either die or miraculously recover, or whatever. But a constitution isn't like that. A constitution is DNA. The Constitution is the essence of a state, which, as a human being, preserves it, enables it to correct faults, to live, to reproduce. And that's something much, much deeper. And all of us should be aware of that understanding of the term, which is the understanding of Edmund Burke, of Benjamin Disraeli. I mean, Disraeli's got a wonderful illustration of how silly written constitutions are. He says the great curse of Latin America is that they all wanted to be like the United States. So all these silly bits and pieces of the Spanish Empire then sort of deck themselves out with, you know, supreme courts and presidents independence and whatever, and immediately lapse into particularly nasty dictatorships. The curse of Europe in the 19th and 20th century was they all wanted to be like Britain. And the curse of the Commonwealth was we gave all these African countries ridiculous Westminster-style parliaments.
I agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg that it seemed to me a complete folly for the Conservatives to put up a candidate in the Gorton and Denton by-election. There's absolutely no chance of the Conservatives winning it. Jacob was very clear to say if there is a Conservative candidate, I would vote for them if I was in the constituency. But I think arrangements like that need to be practically done. In the local elections, I'm actually in Wandsworth. Probably the Conservatives are stronger than Reform in that particular area of southwest London. And where I hail from in Berkshire, that's probably true as well. I think that the Conservatives are somewhat stronger than Reform. As far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned, and I had a fleeting relationship with them about 20 years ago. It's extraordinary, isn't it? They waited 100 years for a big issue to come along in which the people would rebel against the establishment, namely Brexit. And when it happened, they found themselves on the same side of the line as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and the establishment. But I actually think quite a lot of people who vote Liberal Democrat think of them as radicals who want to reset, who want to empower people, and they're not. They are a part of the establishment like any other. That'd be my take. But what's yours, David, on the tactical voting? How should we cast our vote?
I think I hope, it's quite clear the last, and your memory of this sort of stuff is so much better than mine. The last election, by-election, that Reform unexpectedly, Runcorn, you saw very clear tactical voting on the left. And
Caerphilly, where Cymru won.
And also there. And I think that there needs to, how can I put this in terms compatible with the rest of my existence? Perhaps we need on the right to reflect on the need for tactical voting. Leave it as gently as that. But I think there's a bigger point on Lib Dems. My guess is that as this government becomes more extreme, as it will, because it will lurch to the left, don't be under any illusion. It will get much, much worse. And I think Lib Dems, the Lib Dem vote, which at the moment is a sort of soft conservative, often driven by snobbery about reform, I think that will find itself crushed very sharply against fiscal reality as taxation mounts and as the economy crashes. That would be my guess, but it's a guess.
Let's forward wind to June 2029. The clock strikes 10, the exit poll comes out, and Fiona Bruce or somebody tells us Reform on track to win 362 seats, comfortable majority for Nigel Farage. Do we then get violence in the streets within minutes? Or is this just another thing that one needs to game out and plan for, not just a kind of
I think again,
gaming it?
I think it is very worth considering. Again, and it can't be done before there's a reform government. The need for a thorough purging of the higher command of the police force, for a removal of things like Black Police Officers Associations and Muslim Police Officers Association, the catastrophic consequences of the Lawrence Report for policing and so on. All of this has to be addressed. But the problem is it's always chicken and egg with government. But what we need is, as you said, there needs to be the gaming. There needs to stop just striking public positions, having nice, jolly conferences, having, Andrea Jenkins entering with household fireworks and a blue dress and terribly singing off key. There needs to be seriousness. There has to be seriousness. There has to be seriousness.
Then Andrew asked about how do you think your claims analysis calls recipe is going down in the Conservative Party from Kemi Badenoch downwards?
I know nothing about Badenoch's response at all. I've had discussions and detailed ones with Alex Burkhart who is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and is in charge of conservative policy, and he claims to be entirely persuaded. And the decisions which again, has flown in the face of conservative, again, let's be fair to Badenoch, the announced decision to leave the ECHR is a direct challenge to the entire position of the Conservative Party since 2005, and in many cases very, very much longer. It is important to understand that, and that seemed to me to be an incredibly important step. On the other hand, you see, as I remember, and you're better at this than I am, Mark, I think a pledge to withdraw from the ECHR has appeared in every Conservative manifesto for the last...
Well, to get immigration down.
But I think there was also, at least in
Michael Howard, I think was in favour.
In 2019, I think there was a pledge.
No, in 2019.
No, I'm wrong.
Michael
okay.
Howard was
right,
in
okay.
favour.
But it represents a major step. Now, how far it will hold, because one of the great problems is one of the most distinguished of Conservative he's no longer backbench MP, Jesse Norman, is actually the son-in-law of Tom Bingham, and his devoted disciple. And the savage attack on Jenrick when he first went public on suggesting the withdrawal from the ECHR was launched by Jesse Norman. So, I mean, the Conservative, you made this point before, the Conservative Party remains completely divided on all the big questions.
Yeah, and therefore, yes, this is my worry, is that the Conservatives have had a tendency for the last 10 years to look at every binary question and always give the answer 0.5. Well, the answer to a binary question has to be 1 or 0, but the Conservatives often said 0.5. David asked about socialism eventually runs out of people's money. Might this actually just, on the economic side, might this actually just become a practical issue rather than an ideological one? My friend Art Laffer of the Laffer curve fame always says that he believes that his prescriptions are questions not of ideology but of maths. And the great thing about unsustainable economic policies is, guess what? They're not sustained eventually. So what's your thought there, that we might actually hit the buffers because of a practical mathematical economic reality, and ideology just becomes irrelevant, the money just runs out?
Well, again, I mean, I think that we are showing every sign. History does not repeat itself, but similar circumstances bring about similar patterns. We are manifestly rerunning the 1970s. Of course we are. The split in the Conservative Party, the collapse of a long-established structure of government, in political insurgency, because Thatcherism was a form of political insurgency. And also, we had exactly the things we're talking about. We had the intervention of the IMF, the 76 crisis, and then you had Birmingham writ large in 79 with the Winter of Discontent. And I think it quite likely. But the trouble is the amount of damage that's done to that point. And the point you, Mark, have made, that if you look in 76, the resources of the IMF, the percentage of the resources of the IMF that were taken to sort out sterling were about 10%. If you look at our current obligations, you'll be looking at an unthinkable 50% of the resources of the IMF. Unthinkable. Not going to happen. But you see, I think it's worse than that. With a majority of the size that they've got, the amount of latitude to do damage, constantly to rack up taxation. The point is that there is a terrible conspiracy. People talk about the bond market limiting government. The bond market is completely satisfied if you ruin the economy, providing you extract enough tax to pay the bondholders. And we're in that situation. It aspires to be in the public narrative. I think the idea of multiculturalism is a catastrophe. That it is a simple catastrophe. That we will never be a monocultural society, and we never have been. Britain is not a single nation. It never has been. It's called the United Kingdom of England and Scotland. And it had a principality, and it had a second odd kingdom, which became a fragmentary province called Ireland. It had the Principality of Wales. And remember, you were British abroad, and you were English or Scots or Welsh or whatever it was at home. But there was a very clear point. Scotland, Wales, Ireland, whatever, were mostly cultural nationalisms. They were about national dress, national music, the whole horror of Burns Night and the food is filthy. I mean, it's the food of a very poor people, of a very poor nation. Neeps. Anyway, but there was a single buying in to a political culture that was essentially English. And we've got to go back to that. And I think it's entirely possible. I tell the story of some of our most successful immigrants, Jewish. My experience, I call it biculturalism. Back in my days of the moral maze, I had a very strange on-off, rather tense relationship with one of my fellow panelists, Hugo Gryn, who was the rabbi of the liberal West London synagogue, and the relationship was really quite tense. Hugo on one occasion, David, you're not half as nasty as you appear, and my response, and you, Hugo dear, aren't half as nice. Which got the general tone of the relationship. But he did something very extraordinary. He invited myself and my late partner James to the Passover. I've never ever forgotten it. Suddenly, this man who was just, yet another figure in public debate, Radio 4, whatever, to the left of me, but not terribly much so, suddenly became a priest at his own table. I've never seen anything like it. I've never forgotten it. But it's that doubleness which Jews have managed, Chinese manage, Hindus manage. Look at Rishi Sunak. And it's deeply impressive. And I think that's the way forward. But it involves that recognition of a common political, historical, and cultural framework. And one of the persons who could do most to lead the example on that should be the monarch.
Mm-hmm. We well overrun our time. Thank you to all of you. I know we're going to get a few words from your chairman. From our chairman. Just to remind you, if you haven't signed up to Popular Conservatism and you're interested in doing so, just go to our website, popularconservatism.com, or find me and get my business card. It'd be great to keep in touch.
You're sounding like a radio advertisement.
I am a radio advertisement. It's what pays the bills eventually. But we won't be asking you for any money. But please remain involved if you're interested in what we've discussed this evening. And my huge thanks to my good friend and clearly the greatest conservative public intellectual in our nation today, David Starkey.